You reached for it this morning. You didn't even look. Maybe it was at a diner or in your own kitchen, sitting in a cheap plastic shaker or a ceramic bowl. You took a pinch of those tiny white crystals, scattered them over your eggs or your steak, and forgot about them the second they touched the heat. To you, it is the cheapest thing in the room. It costs pennies. It is so common that we use it as a metaphor for things that have no value, not worth his salt. It is an afterthought, an invisible grain of sand in the gears of modern life. But you are holding a miracle. To understand why those crystals are in your hand, you have to look past the grocery store shelf and the industrial salt mines. You have to look at your own blood. Every human being walking the earth today is essentially a walking, breathing container of the prehistoric ocean. We carry the sea inside us. Our tears are salty. Our sweat is salty. Our cells bathe in a saline solution that allows our nerves to fire and our muscles to move. Without that specific concentration of sodium, your heart stops beating. Your brain stops sending signals. You die. For most of human history, that biological fact wasn't a piece of trivia, it was a death sentence. Because unlike water, which falls from the sky, or fire, which can be sparked from a stone, salt was a geologically stubborn treasure. It was locked in the earth or dissolved in the sea, and if you lived in the deep forests or the high mountains, finding it was a matter of life and death. But the real power of salt wasn't just that it kept you alive, it's that it allowed you to conquer time. Step back. Forget the refrigerator. Forget the freezer. Forget the vacuum-sealed plastic and the chemical preservatives. It is the year 1100, and it is late October in a small village in Central Europe. The air is turning sharp. The leaves are dying. And for you, this is the most terrifying time of the year. You have spent the summer working until your hands bled, growing grain and raising livestock. But now, winter is coming. And winter is a predator. In a world without refrigeration, every piece of meat, every fish, every vegetable is a ticking clock. The moment an animal is slaughtered, the rot begins. Bacteria, invisible and relentless, start to tear the flesh apart. In 3 days, the meat is gray. In 5 days, it is a toxic mess of green decay and maggots. In a week, it is poison. You cannot eat an entire cow in 3 days, and if you cannot save that meat, your family will not see the spring. You are looking at a pile of food that should feed you for 4 months, but it is dissolving into filth before your eyes. You are losing the race against the clock. This was the brutal reality for every human being for 10,000 years. We were slaves to the seasons. We could only eat what was fresh, or we could starve. Civilization was a fragile local thing because you couldn't move food, you couldn't store it, you couldn't build a city in a place that didn't have a constant daily supply of fresh kill. And then you discover the crystal. When you rub salt into a piece of meat, you are performing a violent chemical miracle. Salt is hygroscopic. It hungers for water. It reaches into the cells of the bacteria and the fibers of the meat, and it rips the moisture out. It dehydrates the enemy. It creates a desert on the surface of the food where no rot can survive. Suddenly, the clock stops. That piece of pork that would have been a lethal sludge in a week, now it can sit in a barrel for 6 months. It can be carried across a desert. It can be loaded onto a ship and sailed across the Atlantic. Salt was the first battery for human energy. It allowed us to store the summer's harvest and discharge it in the dead of winter. It turned food from a fleeting, rotting burden into a durable, portable commodity. It was the first time humanity defeated the entropy of nature. But because salt was the only way to defeat death, it became the most valuable substance on the planet. It became white gold. To the ancients, salt wasn't a seasoning. It was a strategic resource, as vital as oil is today. If your city had salt, you survived. If your enemy held the salt mines, you were their slave. This is where the word salary comes from, salarium. The Roman legions were sometimes paid in salt or given an allowance to buy it. Why? Because you couldn't eat gold. Gold couldn't keep your rations from rotting in the heat of the Gallic Wars. A soldier without salt was a soldier who would eventually starve or die of a sodium deficiency. Think about that the next time you look at a salt shaker. You are looking at the substance that paid for the Roman Empire. You were looking at the reason the first great roads were built, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, designed specifically to bring those crystals from the coast to the heart of the city. Humanity has fought more wars over these tiny white grains than over almost any flag or religion. We have built empires on its back, and we have watched them crumble because of attacks on a single pinch of it. We take it for granted because we live in the age of the invisible miracle. We have conquered the rot with electricity and chemicals, and so salt has been demoted. It went from the savior of civilizations to a health warning on the back of a soup can. But the white gold hasn't lost its power. It's just waiting. And to see how that power once gripped the throat of the world, we have to go to the places where salt was born, and where men were willing to crawl into the dark, miles beneath the earth, just to touch it. If you could travel back 500 years and show a common laborer the salt shaker on your table, he wouldn't see a condiment, he would see blood. He would see the scorched forests of Europe and the blind horses of the Polish underground. To you, salt is a chemical compound. To the ancestors who built the world you live in, salt was a substance that had to be dragged screaming from the grip of nature. The central problem of human civilization was this: salt is everywhere, but it is almost impossible to get. It is in the ocean, but you cannot drink it. It is in the earth, but it is buried under millions of tons of stone. For the first thousands of years, humanity tried to boil the ocean. This sounds like a poetic metaphor, but for the coastal people of the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and the ancient shores of China, it was a grueling alchemical nightmare. They created salterns, massive, shallow clay pans where they trapped seawater and waited for the sun to do the work. But the sun is fickle. In the damp, gray climates of Northern Europe or Britain, the sun wasn't enough. You had to use fire. Imagine the coast of Cheshire or the shores of France in the year 1400. The air isn't salty and fresh, it is thick with the choking, black smoke of 1,000 peat fires. This was the first great industrial environmental disaster. To produce a single ton of salt, you had to burn an entire forest. Great lead pans, filled with briny water, sat over roaring furnaces day and night. Laborers, their skin perpetually cracked and weeping from the saline steam, stood over these vats with long wooden rakes, stirring the boiling liquid until the water vanished and the crystals remained. This was the salt fever. The demand was so high that by the late Middle Ages, the forests of Europe were being hollowed out. In regions like Lüneburg in Germany, the earth itself began to sink because they had cut down every tree for miles to feed the salt pans, and the water table shifted in protest. We talk about the Industrial Revolution beginning with coal and iron in the 1700s, but the true revolution began centuries earlier, fueled by the desperate need to boil water to find the white gold. But as the forests vanished, humanity realized they had to go deeper. They had to stop looking at the horizon and start looking into the abyss. This is where the story turns into a horror movie. In places like Hallstatt, Austria, or Wieliczka, Poland, humans discovered that the earth was hiding massive subterranean cathedrals of salt, the dried remains of oceans that had vanished millions of years before the first human took a breath. And to get to it, they had to build the most terrifying workplaces in history. Walk into the Wieliczka mine in the 16th century. You are leaving the world of light. You are descending hundreds of feet into a labyrinth of white stone. The air here is strange. It is incredibly dry, so dry that it mummifies anything that dies within it. But it is also heavy. The walls are not made of rock, they are made of salt, and salt is alive. It shifts, it groans under the weight of the world above. In these mines, the hierarchy of the surface was forgotten. There were men who spent their entire lives in the dark. They were called the salt men. They worked in 12-hour shifts, hacking at the walls with iron picks. The dust was everywhere. It got into their lungs. It got into their eyes. It turned their sweat into a caustic brine that ate through their clothes and eventually their skin. But the humans weren't the only ones in the dark. For centuries, the great salt mines of Europe were powered by horses. These animals were lowered into the mines in slings, dangling over the dark pits, terrified and kicking. Once they reached the bottom, they stayed there. Many of these horses lived 10, 15, 20 years without ever seeing a single ray of sunlight. They grew thick, shaggy coats to deal with the constant 50-degree temperature. They went blind within months because their eyes adapted to the flickering torchlight, and the pupils grew so wide that the sun would have burned them. They worked in the silence, pulling massive wooden drums that hoisted the salt blocks to the surface, their hooves clopping on floors made of pure crystal. When a horse finally died, it was often butchered right there in the dark, or its body was left to be absorbed by the salt. There are legends in Poland of crystal horses, animals that were so permeated by the salt that they became statues of themselves after death, glittering in the torchlight like something out of a nightmare. And why? Why this agony? Why subject men and beasts to the lightless void? Because the salt from these mines created the first super cities. Take Venice. We think of Venice as a city of art, of canals, of glass blowers, and Casanova. But Venice was built on a foundation of salt. The early Venetians realized that the salt lagoons surrounding their islands were more valuable than a gold mine. They didn't just produce salt, they monopolized it. They used their navy to destroy the salt works of their neighbors. They forced every ship that entered the Adriatic to carry a salt quota. With the money from salt, they bought the wood for their ships. With the salt itself, they preserved the fish that fed their sailors. Venice was the OPEC of the 13th century. They understood the most fundamental law of power. If you control the salt, you control the survival of the world. The city of Salzburg in Austria, literally Salt Castle, owes its entire existence to the white veins in the mountains above it. The prince archbishops who ruled the city were some of the wealthiest men in Europe, not because they were holy, but because they held the keys to the mines. They built cathedrals and palaces with salt money. Every time a peasant in a village 500 miles away salted his winter pork, a fraction of a coin went into the pockets of the lords in Salzburg. This created a geographical lottery. If you lived on a salt dome, you were a king. If you didn't, you were a customer, and the price of your life was whatever the salt lords decided it was. But there is a dark irony to salt production. Salt is a preservative for meat, but it is a destroyer of humans. In the mines, the very thing that kept the world's food from rotting was rotting the men who found it. The salt fever wasn't just a metaphor for greed, it was a physical ailment. Prolonged exposure to salt dust causes a terrifying dehydration of the mucous membranes. Your throat becomes a desert. Your skin loses its elasticity. You become a living jerky. Yet the rush never stopped, because by the year 1600, the world had become addicted. Salt was no longer just about survival, it was the engine of global trade. The salt from France was being traded for the fur of Canada. The salt from the Caribbean was being used to preserve the cod of the Grand Banks, which in turn fed the enslaved people on the sugar plantations of the West Indies. The white gold had woven a web across the planet, a web made of suffering, fire, and deep-sea darkness. But as salt became more essential, the people in power noticed something. They noticed that a human being can go without many things: jewels, silk, fine wine, even a bed. But a human being cannot go without salt. It is the one thing you must buy. And in the eyes of a king, that didn't look like a biological necessity. It looked like the perfect tax. And that realization, that you could tax the very ability of a person to stay alive, was about to set the world on fire. It was about to turn the white gold into a red revolution. If you want to understand how a government can commit daylight robbery without ever touching a window, you have to look at the dinner table of a French peasant in the year 1780. There is no meat there. There is no wine. There is only a bowl of gray gruel and a crust of stale bread. And yet, standing in the shadow of that table is the King of France. He isn't there for the food, he is there for the salt. In the 18th century, France was governed by a word that made men tremble, the gabelle. To us, a tax is a percentage of a sale. It is a line on a receipt. But the gabelle was something far more sinister. It was a tax on biology. The French monarchy realized what the Romans had realized centuries before. You can stop buying silk, you can stop drinking ale, you can even stop wearing shoes. Но вы не можете перестать есть соль. Your body will not allow it. And because you must have it, the king decided he would be the only one to sell it to you. The gabelle wasn't just a tax, it was a state-enforced monopoly of the most brutal kind. The king owned the salt works, he owned the warehouses, and he set the price at whatever level he needed to pay for his wars, his palaces, and his mistresses. In some regions of France, the price of salt was pushed to 20 times its actual value. It was as if today, a gallon of milk suddenly cost $200, and the only person allowed to sell it to you was the president. But the true insanity of the gabelle, the part that sounds like a dark fever dream, was a law called the sel de devoir, the salt of duty. The government didn't just tax the salt you bought, they forced you to buy it. Every man, woman, and child over the age of 7 was legally required to purchase a specific amount of salt every week from the king's warehouses. It didn't matter if you were too poor to buy bread. It didn't matter if you had no meat to preserve. You had to hand over your copper coins for the king's salt, or you were a criminal. And there was a catch. This duty salt was only for the table. If you were caught using this specific salt to preserve meat or fish, to actually save your family from winter starvation, you were fined. If you wanted to preserve a pig, you had to buy extra salt, a second, even more expensive preservation salt. The king didn't just want your money, he wanted to control how you survived. To enforce this madness, the monarchy created the most hated police force in human history, the gabelous. Imagine you are sitting in your hut at midnight. The door is kicked open. These aren't soldiers looking for spies, they are salt guards. They have the legal right to search your pockets, your cupboards, and even the straw of your mattress. They are looking for white gold that doesn't have the king's seal. They would taste the soup in your pot to see if it was too salty, a sign that you had smuggled in cheaper salt from a neighboring province. The gabelous were predators. They were paid a commission on every fine they collected, which meant they had a financial incentive to find salt where there was none. They would plant salt in a farmer's barn just to arrest him. For over 100 years, the French countryside lived in a state of low-level civil war against the salt guards. The geography of France became a map of injustice. Because of ancient treaties, some provinces were free salt zones, like Brittany, while others were high gabelle zones. If you lived on the border, the temptation was too much. This gave birth to the faux sauniers, the salt smugglers. These weren't just common criminals, they were folk heroes. They were the Robin Hoods of the crystal. Smugglers developed ingenious ways to move salt across the internal borders of France. They sewed hidden pockets into their coats. They built false bottoms into wagons. Some even trained dogs to do the work. They would fit a dog with a leather harness filled with salt and send it running through the woods at night, knowing the gabellas were less likely to shoot a dog than a man. But if a man was caught, the price was his life. The punishment for salt smuggling was the galleys. This is a word that has lost its horror in the modern world, but in 1750 it was a sentence to a living hell. You were chained to a wooden bench on a massive warship. You lived, slept, and worked in your own filth. You rode until your heart gave out or your back broke under the lash of the overseer. Thousands of Frenchmen, fathers, brothers, sons, were sent to the galleys for the crime of trying to buy salt at a fair price. By the 1780s, the gabelle had become the symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the indignity. It was about the fact that the king had turned the very chemical of life into a chain around the necks of his people. When the French Revolution finally ignited in 1789, people didn't just shout for liberty or equality. They shouted for no gabelle. One of the very first acts of the revolutionary government was to abolish the salt tax. They hunted down the gabellas. They burned the king's salt warehouses to the ground. They saw the salt tax as a robbery of the sun, much like the window tax, but far more visceral, because you can live in the dark, but you cannot live without the grain. The tragedy is that the white gold is so addictive to governments that even the revolution couldn't stay away from it for long. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who rose from the ashes of the revolution, brought the salt tax back just a few years later. He needed the money to pay for his grand armée. He realized what every tyrant realizes. If you want to fund a dream of empire, you must squeeze the salt from the blood of the peasants. This is the hidden shadow of salt. It created the wealth of the Renaissance, but it also built the gallows of the 18th century. It was the first oil, the first commodity that was so essential that a government could use it to break the will of its people. We look at the French Revolution and we see the guillotine. We see Marie Antoinette. But underneath the politics and the blood, there was a simple white crystal. A crystal that people were willing to die for, not because it was beautiful, but because without it, the world began to rot. And as the age of kings began to fade, salt was about to embark on its final, most world-shaking journey. It was about to cross the oceans, not as a tax, but as the fuel for a new kind of empire, one built on the backs of the millions who were being forced to work the sugar and tobacco fields of the New World. Salt was no longer just staying at the table, it was going to sea, and the white gold was about to meet the black gold of human labor. If you want to understand why the map of the world looks the way it does, you have to stop looking at the compass and start looking at the barrel. We are taught in school that the age of discovery was a triumph of navigation, courage, and the sextant. We are told that men like Columbus, Magellan, and Cook conquered the oceans with iron will. But that is a sanitized myth. The truth is much more visceral. The oceans were not conquered by maps, they were conquered by salt. Before the steam engine, every wooden ship was a floating prison of biology. A ship was a closed system, a tiny wooden island lost in a desert of salt water that you could not drink. And the greatest enemy of the sailor wasn't the storm or the kraken, it was the rot. In the heat of the tropics, a fresh side of beef turns into a lethal biohazard in 48 hours. Without a way to preserve calories, a ship's crew would be dead of starvation before they reached the midpoint of the Atlantic. Salt was the only thing that allowed a human being to stay at sea for more than a week. It was the fuel of the wooden empire. When you look at a painting of an 18th century man of war, you see the cannons and the white sails, but inside the hold, stacked floor to ceiling, were hundreds of oak barrels. This was the salted life. Inside those barrels was salt junk, beef and pork that had been cured in so much brine that the meat turned as hard as a piece of mahogany. To eat it, sailors had to soak the meat in fresh water for 24 hours just to make it soft enough to chew, and even then, it tasted like a lick of pure lye. It was a brutal little bargain. You could eat the salt and live, even as the salt dried out your skin and made your joints ache, or you could reject it and watch your food dissolve into maggots. Salt was the anchor that kept the human body from drifting into decay while the ship drifted across the blue void. But the real white gold of the ocean wasn't the meat in the barrels, it was a fish, the cod. To understand the global economy of the 1600s, you have to understand that the North Atlantic was a gold mine, but the gold was silver gray and had scales. The Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland were so thick with cod that early explorers claimed you could walk across the water on their backs. This was an infinite supply of protein, a way to feed the surging populations of a hungry Europe. There was just one problem. Newfoundland is 1,000 miles from London, Lisbon, or Paris. You cannot transport 1,000,000 pounds of fish in a wooden boat across the Atlantic summer without a miracle. Salt was that miracle. The salt cod became the first truly global commodity. In the fishing stations of the North Atlantic, the process was a bloody industrial assembly line. Thousands of men spent their lives in a fog of salt dust. They would catch the cod, slit them open, rip out the spine, and then pack them in white gold. The salt would draw out the water, turning the soft, flaky fish into a hard, white board. This salted cod was indestructible. You could stack it like lumber. You could leave it in a damp cellar for a year. You could toss it in the bottom of a boat and sail it to the equator. It was the hard drive of the 17th century. It stored the protein of the cold north and allowed it to be downloaded in the heat of the south. But this is where the story of salt takes its darkest turn, because the primary market for all that salted cod wasn't the fine dining rooms of Europe. It was the plantations of the Caribbean and South America. We often talk about the black gold of the slave trade and the white gold of sugar, but we forget the white gold that sat between them. The enslaved people working the sugar fields of Barbados, Jamaica, and Brazil were being worked to death in a high-calorie nightmare. To keep that labor force alive as cheaply as possible, the plantation owners needed a mass-produced, shelf-stable protein. Salted cod was the answer. The salt cod empire was the hidden infrastructure of slavery. The ships would bring salt from the Mediterranean to Newfoundland. They would use it to cure the fish. Then they would sail that fish to the Caribbean to feed the enslaved populations. And finally, they would fill their holds with sugar and rum for the trip back to Europe. Salt was the chemical glue that held the triangle trade together. Without the ability to preserve that fish, the economics of the plantation system would have collapsed. Salt, the substance of life, was being used to maximize the efficiency of a system of death. This created a desperate global hunger for salt lagoons. If you were a naval power like Britain or the Netherlands, you couldn't rely on the salt mines of your enemies. You needed your own white gold mines in the sun. This led to the salt wars of the Caribbean. Take the island of Tortuga or the salt pans of St. Martin. These weren't fought over for their beauty. They were fought over because they were natural factories. The sun would beat down on the shallow lagoons, evaporating the Caribbean seawater and leaving behind crusts of salt as thick as ice. The Dutch, in particular, were obsessed. In the 1630s, when they were blocked from the salt pans of Spain, they sent an entire fleet to the coast of Venezuela to seize the salt lagoons of Punta de Araya. They built a massive stone fortress there, one of the most expensive in the New World, not to protect gold or silver, but to protect a shallow pond of brine. They knew that if they lost the salt, they lost the cod, and if they lost the cod, they lost their grip on the world. There is a strange, quiet tragedy in this. For the sailors and the fishermen, salt was a constant physical torment. Salt sores were a standard occupational hazard. If you spend months with salt dust in your clothes and brine on your skin, your body begins to break down. The salt draws the moisture out of your very pores, leaving you with weeping, unhealing wounds. The very thing that made the empire possible was eating the men who built it. And then there is the paradox of scurvy. For centuries, sailors died by the thousands because of a mysterious illness that made their teeth fall out and their old scars reopen. We know now it was a lack of vitamin C. Но в то время многие считали, что виновата соль. They called it the salt disease. They thought the sailors were literally turning into statues of salt from the inside out. They weren't entirely wrong about the feeling. Living on a diet of 100% salted rations is a form of slow poisoning. You are surviving, yes, but you are surviving in a state of biological emergency. By the late 1700s, the salted world had reached its peak. Every harbor in the world smelled of brine and drying cod. The white gold had connected the continents, fed the navies of the great powers, and fueled the most horrific labor system in human history. But as the 19th century dawned, the world was about to change again. The age of the wooden barrel was coming to an end. A new kind of energy was being pulled from the earth, coal, and with coal came the steam engine. Humanity was about to find a way to freeze time without using a single grain of salt. We were about to invent the refrigerator. And in that moment, salt, the savior of ships, the master of the oceans, the white gold of the cod lords, was about to lose its crown. The preservative of kings was about to become a tabletop toy. But before it vanished into the background, it had one last war to win. A war that would decide the fate of a new nation rising in the West. A war where salt would become a weapon of mass destruction. If you want to find the exact moment when the white gold decided the fate of a nation, you have to look at a map of the American South in the year 1862. We are taught that the Civil War was won by ironclads, repeating rifles, and the industrial might of the North. We are told about the genius of Grant and the fire of Sherman. Но в архивах той войны есть слово, которое повторяется чаще, чем порох или золото. Это слово «соль». In the 1860s, the United States was a nation of salt. The frontier was pushed forward by salt licks, natural deposits where animals gathered to lick the earth and where hunters followed to find the animals. These licks became the coordinates for the first great roads into the wilderness. But as the country tore itself in half, salt stopped being a part of the landscape and became the single most critical point of failure for the Confederate States of America. To understand the desperation of the South, you have to understand the Union's Anaconda Plan. The North didn't just want to beat the Southern armies, they wanted to suffocate them. They blockaded the ports, cutting off the flow of everything from the outside world. And the thing that hurt them most wasn't the lack of French wine or English silk, it was the sudden, catastrophic disappearance of salt. The South was a land of pork. Every soldier in the Confederate Army lived on a ration of salted pork. Every family on every farm, from Virginia to Texas, survived the winter on the pigs they slaughtered in November and packed into salt barrels. But the South didn't have enough salt mines. They had relied on salt from Liverpool and the West Indies. When the Union ships arrived at the coast, the white gold vanished. Suddenly, salt was more valuable than Confederate money. The price of a sack of salt in Richmond soared from $2 to $60, then to $100. It reached a point where the state governments had to step in and take control of the salt supply, much like the French gabelle. They began rationing salt by the ounce. Imagine you are a mother in Alabama in 1863. Your husband is at the front. You have 3 children. You have a pig, but you have no salt. You know that if you cannot preserve that meat, your children will starve by February. This was the silent horror of the war. Women began to riot. In towns across the South, groups of desperate women, the salt rioters, armed themselves with knives and pistols and stormed government warehouses, not for gold, but for a handful of brine. But the Union knew this. They understood that to kill the Confederate Army, they didn't need to shoot every soldier. They just needed to burn the salt. This was the birth of salt burning. The Union Navy began a relentless campaign along the coasts of Florida and the Carolinas. They weren't looking for forts, they were looking for salt works. These were massive, sprawling industrial sites where Southerners were desperately trying to boil seawater in giant iron vats to replace the blockaded salt. A Union raid on a salt work was a scene of industrial devastation. The sailors would land, drive off the workers, and then go to work with sledgehammers. They would smash the iron vats, thousands of them, into scrap. Они сжигали запасы дров. Они разрушали насосы. In a single raid on St. Andrews Bay, Florida, the Union Navy destroyed over 500 salt works in a week. They effectively wiped out the ability of the region to feed itself. As the coastal salt works died, the South turned to their last hope, a tiny town in Virginia called Saltville. For a few years, Saltville was the most important city in the Confederacy. It sat on top of a massive, prehistoric salt dome. Every day, trains loaded with barrels of white gold steamed out of Saltville to feed the armies of Robert E. Lee. The Union Army became obsessed with this place. They launched 2 massive, bloody invasions just to capture the salt wells. When they finally took it in 1864, they didn't just occupy the town. They filled the wells with debris. They smashed the kettles. They salted the earth so that no salt could be made. Sherman himself, as he marched through Georgia, ordered his troops to destroy every salt barrel they found. "Salt is eminently contraband," he wrote. He knew that a soldier who cannot eat is a soldier who cannot fight. The gray lines of the Confederate Army didn't just break because of the bayonet. They broke because their bodies were literally failing from a lack of sodium and the rot of unpreserved rations. But as the war ended and the smoke cleared, the world of salt was being reborn. The struggle for white gold during the war had proven how dangerous it was to rely on the sun or the coast. The age of industrial salt was beginning. In the late 1800s, beneath the Great Lakes and the plains of Kansas and New York, men discovered salt deposits so vast they made the Roman mines look like sandboxes. These were no longer the crystal cathedrals of Poland. These were industrial factories of the deep. This was the era of the Salt Trust. Companies like the International Salt Company and Morton Salt began to consolidate. They used a new technology, solution mining. Instead of sending men down with picks, they drilled holes into the salt domes and pumped in millions of gallons of fresh water. The water would dissolve the salt into a saturated brine, which was then pumped back to the surface. It was clean, it was fast, and it was infinite. Salt was becoming cheap. For the first time in human history, the white gold was losing its gold status. It was becoming a commodity. But this abundance created a new problem. Salt was now so plentiful that the old salt works, the fire breathers on the coast, were going bankrupt. To survive, the new salt kings had to find new uses for their product. They turned to the laboratory. This is the hidden chapter of salt that nobody thinks about. In the late 19th century, salt became the DNA of the chemical industry. Using a process called the Solvay process, engineers figured out how to turn common salt into soda ash and chlorine. Suddenly, your salt wasn't just in your food, it was in your glass. It was in your soap. It was in the bleach used to whiten your clothes. It was in the paper of the newspaper you read. The white gold had transformed from a preservative of life into the invisible building block of modern chemistry. And yet, there was one final struggle. As salt became a mass-produced industrial product, it lost its purity. The industrial salt was often gray, clumpy, and bitter. It was fine for a factory, but it was terrible for the kitchen. This led to one of the most famous marketing campaigns in history. In 1911, the Morton Salt Company developed a way to keep salt from clumping in damp weather by adding a tiny amount of magnesium carbonate. They gave it a slogan that every American knows: when it rains, it pours. It was a revolution. For thousands of years, salt was a clumpy, difficult substance that you had to keep in a dry box near the fire. Now, it was a free-flowing, white powder that could sit on your table in any weather. The white gold had been tamed. It had been standardized. It had been democratized. But in that democratization, something was lost. The salt sense, the deep ancestral understanding that this substance was sacred, began to fade. We stopped seeing the blood in the brine. Мы перестали чувствовать запах сгоревших лесов и стоны лошадей в шахтах. But as salt became a cheap, invisible powder in the West, it was about to ignite one last great revolution on the other side of the world. Because while Americans were enjoying their free-flowing table salt, a man in a white loincloth was preparing to walk to the sea in India. He was going to challenge the British Empire, and he was going to do it with nothing but a handful of mud and a grain of salt. The white gold was about to bring down the greatest empire the world had ever seen. In the spring of 1930, the British Empire was the most powerful machine on Earth. It spanned the globe, fueled by steel, coal, and a naval tradition that had never been truly broken. But in the middle of India, a 60-year-old man with a spindly frame, wearing nothing but a hand-spun loincloth and a pair of cheap wooden sandals, decided to destroy that empire. He didn't use a bomb. He didn't use a rifle. He used a handful of mud and a pinch of salt. To understand why the British were terrified of a grain of salt, you have to understand the Indian salt axe. For centuries, India had been a land of salt. From the Rann of Kutch to the shores of Odisha, the sun and the sea provided an endless supply of white gold for free. But the British East India Company, and later the British Raj, saw this natural abundance not as a gift to the people, but as a leak in their revenue. Much like the French monarchy with their gabelle, the British declared that salt was a state monopoly. It became a criminal offense for an Indian person to collect salt from their own backyard. It was illegal to evaporate seawater in a pan. It was illegal to pick up a crust of salt left by the tide. If you wanted to live, you had to buy salt from the British. And the British taxed it heavily, a tax that hit the poorest of the poor in a land where the heat was so intense that salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was a biological requirement for survival. In the sweltering humidity of India, a human being loses grams of sodium every hour through sweat. To deny a peasant salt in that climate is a form of slow, systemic torture. The British were essentially taxing the ability of the Indian body to regulate its own temperature. It was a tax on perspiration, a robbery of the very water inside a man's cells. For decades, Indian nationalists had complained about the salt tax. They wrote letters, they held meetings, they made speeches. The British ignored them. The tax was too profitable to give up. But Mahatma Gandhi understood something that the politicians did not. He understood the microhistory of power. He knew that if you fight an empire over sovereignty or legislative reform, the common person doesn't feel it. But if you fight an empire over a pinch of salt, you are fighting for the dinner table of every mother in the country. You are making the revolution personal. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi set out from his ashram in Ahmedabad on a 240-mile trek to the coastal village of Dandi. He called it the Salt Satyagraha. The British authorities laughed. The Viceroy, Lord Irwin, wrote to London saying that Gandhi's plan to protest the salt tax was amusing and pathetic. How could a walk to the sea challenge the power of the British Crown? They expected Gandhi to collapse in the heat. They expected the public to lose interest. They were wrong. As Gandhi walked, the world watched. This was one of the first truly global media events. Journalists from New York, London, and Berlin followed the small man in white. Every step he took through the dust was a blow to the moral authority of the Raj. By the time he reached the shores of the Arabian Sea 24 days later, he wasn't just a lawyer in a loincloth. He was a symbol of the entire nation's hunger for dignity. On the morning of April 6th, Gandhi walked down to the muddy shore at Dandi. He waded into the water, then reached down and picked up a small lump of natural salt that had been deposited by the tide. It was a tiny, dirty, grayish piece of mineral. It wasn't white gold, it was salt mud. He held it up to the cameras and said, "With this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire." In that moment, Gandhi became the most successful smuggler in history. By picking up that grain, he had broken the law. He had stolen from the king. And within 24 hours, the fire he started at Dandi swept across the subcontinent. Millions of Indians, farmers, students, shopkeepers, and even police officers walked to the nearest coast and began to make their own salt. They boiled seawater in pots on their front porches. They gathered salt in their saris. They sold illegal salt in the streets of Mumbai and Delhi. The British responded with the only thing they knew, the lathi. The images that came next changed the world. At the Dharasana Salt Works, thousands of peaceful, non-violent protesters marched toward the British salt warehouses. They were met by rows of soldiers armed with steel-tipped clubs. The soldiers began to beat them, systematically, brutally, cracking skulls and breaking shoulders. The protesters didn't fight back. They didn't run. They just kept coming, wave after wave, walking into the clubs to be struck down. A journalist named Webb Miller reported the scene to the world. Not one of the marchers even raised an arm to fend off the blows. They went down like tenpins. The ground was littered with bodies. The British won the battle at the salt works, but they lost the war for India. The world saw that the empire was willing to beat unarmed people to death just to protect a tax on a handful of brine. The moral invisibility of the salt tax was gone. The white gold was now stained with the blood of the people who needed it to live. Gandhi was arrested along with 60,000 others, but the Raj was broken. They had realized the terrible truth about salt. It is too small to guard, but too important to lose. You cannot arrest an entire nation for seasoning their food. You cannot put a soldier on every inch of a 1,000-mile coastline. The salt tax remained on the books for a few more years, but it was effectively dead. The British were forced to the negotiating table. For the first time, an Indian leader was treated as an equal by the British Viceroy. And 17 years later, when the British finally packed their bags and left India forever, it wasn't because they had been defeated in a great battle. It was because they had been made irrelevant by a grain of salt. There is a profound irony in Gandhi's victory. He used an ancient biological necessity to win a modern political war. He took a substance that had been used for thousands of years to preserve meat and used it to preserve a culture. But as the 20th century roared on, salt was about to face its most difficult transformation yet. Because while salt was winning revolutions in the East, it was being blamed for a new kind of death in the West. The white gold was about to move from the beach at Dandi to the laboratory of the cardiologist. The preservative that had saved humanity from the rot for 10 millennia was about to be rebranded as a silent killer. We were moving from the age of salt hunger to the age of salt fear. And as we look at the modern world, a world of blood pressure monitors, low sodium diets, and hidden salt in processed food, we have to ask, have we really conquered the crystal, or has it just found a new way to rule us? The final chapters of salt aren't written in the mines or on the battlefields. They are written in our veins. And to see where we are going, we have to look at the strange, invisible way salt still powers the world we live in, even if we've forgotten its name. You are sitting in a small, sterile room. The air is cool, the light is fluorescent, and there is a thin band of black fabric wrapped tightly around your upper arm. A doctor or a nurse is pumping a rubber bulb, and you feel the pressure rise, a dull, thumping squeeze against your pulse. They are measuring your blood pressure, and if those numbers are too high, the very first thing they will tell you is to put down the salt shaker. In this moment, 10,000 years of human history are turned upside down. For 99.9% of our time on this planet, the salt guard was a man with a sword guarding a mine or a king collecting a tax. But today, the salt guard wears a white coat and carries a stethoscope. We have moved from the age of salt hunger to the age of salt fear. The substance that was once worth its weight in gold is now branded as a silent killer, a chemical ghost haunting our arteries and straining our hearts. To understand how we became afraid of the very thing we once worshipped, you have to understand the evolutionary lag of the human tongue. Your tongue is a relic of the Stone Age. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in a world where sodium was a rare, precious find. When they found a salt lick or a brackish spring, their brains exploded with dopamine. "Eat this," the brain whispered. "Eat as much as you can. You don't know when you'll find it again." We evolved a biological craving for salt because it was the only way to ensure we didn't die of a sodium deficiency in a world of rain and forest. But we no longer live in that world. We live in a world where salt is infinite. We have solved the extraction nightmare. We have mastered the logistics of the crystal. And because our tongues are still programmed for a desert of salt, we have walked straight into a trap designed by our own biology. This is the great irony of the 20th century. In the late 1800s, with the invention of the refrigerator and the freezer, everyone assumed that salt would finally disappear. We didn't need the white gold to defeat the rot anymore. We had electricity. We had cold air. The barrel of salt pork should have vanished into the Museum of History, but it didn't. Instead, salt did something much more clever. It moved from the barrel to the recipe. When we started canning food and creating the first convenience meals for the industrial worker, we realized a terrifying secret. Food that is processed, boiled, and sealed in tin tastes like nothing. It tastes like cardboard. The rot was gone, but the soul of the food had vanished with it. To bring it back, the industrial food complex reached for the oldest trick in the book. They reached for the salt. By the 1950s, we were no longer using salt to preserve the meat. We were using it to hide the process. If you walk down a supermarket aisle today, you are walking through a saline minefield. Salt is no longer just in the shaker. It is in the bread to make it fluffy. It is in the cereal to make it crunch. It is in the cookies to balance the sugar. It is even in the soda to make you thirstier so you drink more. We have invisibilized the white gold. We consume on average double or triple the amount of salt our bodies actually need, not because we are choosing to, but because we are eating food that has been pre-salted by a machine in a factory 300 miles away. This is the microhistory of the TV dinner and the canned soup. In a factory, salt isn't just a flavor, it's a processing agent. It allows meat to hold more water, which makes it heavier, which means it can be sold for more money. Salt is the ultimate weight gainer for the global food industry. We aren't just buying salt for the taste, we are being sold water at the price of meat, held together by the chemical bond of the crystal. But the human body cannot handle this industrial flood. In the 1970s, the medical establishment finally sounded the alarm. They began to notice a direct, terrifying link between the modern diet and the explosion of hypertension and heart disease. The white gold was accused of stiffening our blood vessels, forcing our hearts to pump harder, and slowly, year by year, wearing out the machinery of our lives. The war on salt began. Governments started issuing low-sodium guidelines. Food companies started slapping "no salt added" stickers on their cans, stickers that often hid the fact that they had replaced the salt with even more sugar or chemical flavorings to keep the food edible. We became a culture of salt shamers. If you reached for the shaker at a dinner party, you were looked at with the same pity as someone lighting a cigarette in a nursery. Yet here is the part that still doesn't quite make sense. Despite the warnings, despite the silent killer headlines, we cannot quit. Because the salt hunger is deeper than any doctor's advice. This created a new kind of social hierarchy, the gourmet salt revolution. As common table salt, the industrial, free-flowing Morton kind, became a peasant's poison, a new market emerged for the pure crystal. Suddenly, the wealthy weren't looking for just salt. They were looking for Himalayan pink salt, hand-mined in Pakistan. They were looking for fleur de sel, harvested by hand in the marshes of France, using the same wooden rakes their ancestors used 500 years ago. They were looking for black Hawaiian lava salt and smoked Malden sea salt. We have come full circle. Salt has become a status symbol once again. The white gold is no longer about survival, it is about purity and origin. We pay $20 for a small jar of pink crystals, not because they have more sodium, they don't, but потому что у них есть история. We are buying the mineral impurities. We are buying the dirt that the industrial salt works spent a century trying to filter out. To the modern elite, the unrefined crystal is the ultimate luxury. It is a way to signal that you are not eating, quote, factory food. You are eating the, quote, earth. It is a beautiful, expensive delusion. Underneath the pink hue and the gray flakes, it is still the same chemical compound, NaCl. It is still the same ocean that we carry in our blood. It is still the same reaper that strains the heart. And as we sit in that doctor's office, feeling the squeeze of the blood pressure cuff, we realize the final, brutal bargain of the crystal. For 10,000 years, we fought to get enough salt so that we wouldn't starve. We built empires, fought wars, and enslaved millions just to fill our barrels. And we succeeded so completely, we made salt so cheap and so abundant, that now we are fighting to get away from it. We have won the war against the rot, but we are losing the war against the seasoning. But as we look toward the future, salt is preparing for its final act. It isn't just in our veins and our kitchens, it is moving into the high-tech frontier. The white gold that once powered the Roman legions and the British Navy is about to become the green gold of the energy revolution. Because the same properties that allow salt to store the energy of the summer harvest are now being used to store the energy of the sun. The crystal isn't finished with us yet, it is just changing its shape. And to see the end of the story, we have to look at the massive glowing mirrors of the desert and the liquid salt batteries that might just save the planet if we don't let the salt kill us first. We began this story with a pinch of white dust in a diner, a substance so cheap and invisible that you didn't even look at it. We followed it through the deep, lightless mines of Poland, the fire-blackened coastal salt pans of France, the bloody decks of cod-fishing ships, and the sweltering heat of Gandhi's revolution. We saw it build empires, ignite wars, and eventually move into our very blood vessels as a silent killer. But the story of salt isn't a straight line from luxury to commodity. It is a circle. And right now, in the high deserts of Nevada and the arid plains of Spain, salt is reclaiming its throne. It is shedding its skin as a humble seasoning and becoming the white gold of a new high-tech world. To see the future of salt, you have to look at the solar towers. Imagine a landscape that looks like a cathedral of mirrors, thousands of massive gleaming glass panels arranged in a perfect geometric spiral around a central stone pillar that rises 500 feet into the air. These mirrors are designed to track the sun, focusing every ray of light onto a single point at the top of that tower. The heat there is unimaginable. It reaches over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It is enough to melt steel. But the scientists aren't melting steel. They are melting salt. Inside that tower is a tank filled with common salt, sodium nitrate and potassium nitrate. Under the concentrated fury of the mirrors, the solid crystals dissolve into a glowing, white-hot liquid. This is molten salt. And in this state, salt is doing exactly what it did for the medieval peasant 500 years ago. It is storing time. Remember the 12th century winter? Salt was the battery that stored the calories of the summer harvest so you could survive the dark months. In the 21st century, molten salt is the battery that stores the energy of the afternoon sun so we can keep our lights on through the dark night. It holds heat with incredible efficiency. Even after the sun goes down, that liquid salt stays white hot, pumping its energy into steam turbines to generate electricity long after the mirrors have gone dark. We have come full circle. The substance that once preserved the food of empires is now preserving the energy of the planet. But the green revolution of salt goes even deeper. As the world scrambles to find alternatives to expensive rare earth minerals like lithium for our batteries, we are looking back at the ocean. We are developing sodium-ion batteries. The logic is almost poetic. Lithium is hard to find, hard to mine, and controlled by a handful of global powers. But sodium? Sodium is everywhere. It is in every ocean, every salt flat, every kitchen. It is the most democratic mineral on Earth. By moving from lithium to sodium, we are moving from a world of strategic scarcity back to a world of natural abundance. The crystal that once triggered the French Revolution and the Indian Salt March might be the very thing that democratizes the energy of the future. It is the ultimate failed inventor story, but on a geological scale. We spent a century trying to replace salt with chemicals and electricity, only to realize that salt was the better chemical all along. But step back from the mirrors and the laboratories for a moment. Look at yourself. This is the hidden tragedy and the hidden beauty of salt. We call it white gold, but it is actually the blueprint of our existence. You are a saline creature. When you cry, you are leaking the prehistoric ocean that birthed the first life on Earth. When you sweat, you are cooling yourself with the same minerals that fueled the Roman legions. You are a walking, talking monument to the salt mines and the sea. Every cell in your body is a tiny salt work, constantly pumping sodium in and out to keep your heart beating and your thoughts moving. You are not just using salt, you are salt. And this brings us back to those strange, ghost-like monuments we find in history. Walk through an old town in France, and you might find an empty stone building with a high, sloping roof and narrow windows. It looks like a small church or a strange warehouse. It is a grenier à sel, a king's salt granary. 300 years ago, that building was a place of terror. It was where the Gabalas kept the white gold that they used to choke the life out of the poor. It was a fortress of tax and monopoly. Today, it is probably a boutique hotel, a museum, or a ruin that people walk past without a second glance. It is a gravestone for a war we have forgotten we ever fought. We have won the war against the rot. We have won the war against the tax. We have made salt so perfect, so pure, and so abundant that we have rendered it invisible. This is the quiet victory of the mundane. The most hard-won substance in human history, the thing that men were willing to be chained to a galley oar for, the thing that Gandhi walked 240 miles to touch, it has become so ordinary that we treat it as an enemy of our health. We have forgotten that for 10,000 years, the sight of a single white crystal was the only thing that stood between a family and a slow, agonizing death by winter starvation. So the next time you reach for that salt shaker, give it one extra second. Look at those tiny cubic crystals as they fall onto your plate. You aren't just looking at a seasoning. You are looking at the reason the Roman roads were built. You are looking at the fuel of the Atlantic cod fishing fleets. You are looking at the spark that lit the French Revolution. You are looking at the white gold that once bought and sold human lives, and the green gold that might just save our descendants. You are holding the history of the world in the palm of your hand. Most of our struggles leave massive ruins, castles, cathedrals, bunkers. But the struggle for salt ended in a victory so complete that it disappeared into a paper packet at a fast food restaurant. It is a triumph that asks for no attention at all. It just sits there, waiting for you to taste it. Humanity shivered in the dark, hungry and desperate for thousands of years, praying for a way to save the summer for the winter. We schemed, we prayed, we invented, and we finally, completely went right. We tamed the crystal. We conquered the rot. And as you put that salt back on the table and walk away, remember that you are carrying a piece of that victory inside you. Every beat of your heart is a reminder that the war is over. The white gold is finally, truly yours. And if you want to see how another everyday object you take for granted has a story just as bizarre and bloody as this one, I have another story waiting for you right now. Click it and I'll see you there.